author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio's special New Year's edition here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we're looking at everything that happened last year, everything that's going into this next year. It's going to be quite the show. Let's get started. Christmas is over and the new year approaches, and what better time to look back over 2023 to figure out what were the biggest political stories of the year. Now, there's nobody better placed to discuss such things than Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Always good to be here, Mark.
So, Tim, for me, this has been one of the most fascinating years in American politics. It's just, I've seen Joe Biden go from, let's call it half strength to lower, but I've seen Donald Trump besieged by 90 plus criminal charges facing him, and yet go strength to strength. And I don't understand quite the power interplays that are happening here, but that might not even be the biggest story. Tim, what do you consider the biggest story of 2023?
Well, I think the biggest story of 2023 is 2023 is a year I'm going to call the counterintuitive year in politics, because four times Donald Trump was indicted. It added up to 91 charges. And the counterintuitive part is that you would expect if it was anybody else but Donald Trump, 91 charges, even without any convictions, would ruin them, would end their careers. But with Donald Trump, every time he's been indicted, his numbers have risen. It's almost like some sort of indictment strategy, if such a thing could possibly exist, where Trump was inducing them to indict him so that he could increase his popularity, a sort of phenomenon that only he could understand. It's no question, it's hard to understand still Trump's rise, except when you see it in the context of the business of fairness. And I think the average voter sees fairness coming down to some fundamental things, like not trying to throw your political enemy into prison right before a presidential election, and not trying to kick him off the ballot, which of course we saw just recently in Colorado. So it's ironic that in a year where the Democrats have been screaming about the death of democracy and how democracy dies in darkness, that this is, in the words of Jonathan Turley, the most undemocratic opinion he has seen in his entire lengthy career.
Yeah, and that's a long and storied career that he's had. I think the other thing he said was America is a powder keg, and you've got these judges throwing matches at it. I thought that was wonderfully evocative. Yeah, so if we can let's dissect this a bit about how Trump is still managing to go up in the polls on this now. And you said fairness, and I think that's a very important part, because despite what the New York Times or the left-leaning periodicals write about, you know, the American dream was only ever for wealthy white people, that's not why people come to America. You know, all the people who come to America to start their lives and bring their families, they all want a piece of the American dream, and that relies on one thing, doesn't it? That relies on a level playing field, a certain amount of fairness. And if you don't have that, there is no such thing as the American dream, because it's the idea that if I work hard, then I can do better than the person who doesn't work as hard, and I can get what I need. I can get the white picket fence. I can get the nice house in suburbia, you know. And if that doesn't exist, then America's not America. And I think what we're seeing, Tim, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's a visceral, the poll numbers that we're seeing for Trump are a visceral rejection of the idea that the American dream is over. Maybe I'm getting a bit Norman Rockwell around the season.
No, I don't think so, because the sum total of everything that happened in the last year, and the other huge story of the year, of course, is the Hamas invasion of Israel and the subsequent war. And this could well prove to be Waterloo for Biden, because he's at about 32% approval about how he's handled the war in the general public. And of course, his far left flank, on whom he depends for re-election, is furious. They're not going to compromise. This is an explosive, highly explosive emotional issue. We've seen that with the protests in the streets calling for, essentially, for Israel to be wiped off the map. They can try to cleanse that a little bit, but essentially that's what they're calling for. So that's the other big thing this year. And Biden is facing a strong headwind when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's we've talked about this before, but both of the main political parties operate under the big tent premise, right? And so when it comes to an election, everybody sort of, which of these two big tents am I going to sit under? And it seems that the far left, or those, I don't like to call them far left in this situation, although that is where they have been politically represented on the far left. But people who are, as you say, they're openly, even if they pretend that it's not, the idea of the river to the sea, that's calling for the end of Israel and the Israeli people. And it's in Hamas's charter to destroy all the Jews.
And the thing that's particularly tragic about it is that so many of these uneducated youth have no idea.
Uneducated college kids. Let's make this clear.
Yeah, they're either uneducated or so thoroughly indoctrinated in the growing cultural Marxism on American campuses that they have no sense of perspective. When you start to call the Jews oppressors, the people who 6 million of whom, by official count, died at the hands of Germany during World War II, to call them oppressors is, I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't so pathetically off target. Now, Mark, to go one point that we were discussing just a touch earlier, I don't think in my entire career I've ever actually quoted Chris Christie, but let me quote him here. After the Colorado ruling, which no matter which way it would ultimately go at the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, was a shot across the bow by the left. And even Chris Christie, who of course has based his entire campaign on taking down Donald Trump, said, I don't want Donald Trump out of the Oval Office because he's off the ballot. I want him out of the Oval Office because people voted against him. And I think it's pretty much that simple. If people don't have a chance to vote, then in so many ways, I think election interference is yet another story from this year on a broader basis when you add up 91 charges, 91 felony charges, together with being booted off the ballot in a state. If that doesn't constitute election interference, Mark, which is something, of course, that the left keeps crying about with Trump, but if that doesn't constitute election interference, perhaps you could tell me what does.
I'm not claiming anything on that count there, Tim. I think the definitions speak for themselves. Tim Donner, we'll be right back with you after this short break, looking at what's going to happen in 2024 and the big stories to watch for there. Listeners, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here once again.
So earlier in the show, we were talking about the biggest stories of 2023, and the two that we really delved into were Donald Trump's burgeoning popularity, despite the numerous charges he faces in court, and the Israel-Hamas war that's taking place as we speak. Now, I really want to look at what's going to be the big stories for 2024, but I have a suspicion, Tim, that it might be quite similar to our 2023 edition. But please tell me, what's your take on the big stories coming down the pipeline in 2024?
I think 2024, not much is going to happen, Mark.
Yeah, pretty quiet year.
Not. 2024 is, in many ways, you stole my thunder, because I was going to say basically the elements of 2023 are just going to carry over.
Listeners, please note this is an unscripted radio show where we just get talking. So there you go. There's your proof, because I just stole what Tim was hoping to talk about.
Yeah, sure. They all believe you, Mark. They all believe you. In any case, okay, the Israel-Hamas war, we touched on that and the fact that Biden would be facing a headwind, but let's quantify it more precisely, as I did on the pages of LibertyNation.com recently. If you look at the dividing point for the other big story of the year, which is Trump's rise and Biden's descent, the rise began in earnest literally the day after the Hamas invasion of Israel. And that is not probably because of Trump's own policies on Israel, or his record was perfectly fine, I think, in the view of most people, but it was an indictment of the Biden presidency. And this is going to be a huge problem for him going forward, because he is totally unable to consolidate his leftward flank, the people who keep demonstrating and insisting from the river to the sea, Israel must be demolished. This will continue to be a huge issue going forward. The other issue will be the continuing effect, for better as it was in 2023, or for worse. In Donald Trump's, what I would call, he's a full-time professional defendant now. The big question is what happens when inevitably he is convicted of one or more charges. Now, there's been some polling to suggest that Trump could lose up to about 6% of his support with a conviction. But the other thing that just carries over from 2023 is Biden's descent into a state of cognitive decline that is truly, I think, frightening to the American voters, to the point where ideology really isn't even the issue anymore. It becomes fitness for office. And Trump looks the same as he did in 2016.
He does. It's weird. It's very weird.
It's strange. It's as if he hasn't aged at all in an 8-year period where Joe Biden has hit the skids to the point where a solid majority of the country believes he's too old to do the job. So I think all these things carry over to 2024. I think the big X question, what happens once Trump is convicted?
Well,
and that's going to come probably in the spring or early summer, and will certainly have an impact on the race, no question.
Here's I'm going to play the devil's advocate a bit here. You being the devil, me being an advocate. So
as always, Mark.
As always. So there's as you point out, there's that polling. 6% would probably change their vote or stay home if Trump is convicted. Now, there's nothing to stop Trump from continuing his campaign. There's nothing in the Constitution to stop Trump continuing his campaign, even if he's convicted, even if he's sent to prison, which, let's be honest, would be an utterly unworkable physicality. Although I'm sure a lot of people would.
Well, we already
accommodations for it.
We already have a precedent, because the much maligned Lyndon LaRouche actually was a declared presidential candidate while he was in prison. So there's a precedent for that.
So Trump could, even if he won, I don't know how they'd work the mechanics of it, but if he were in prison and he won, he could still be president. There's nothing constitutionally that bars him from that. But here's the thing. If he is convicted, because we have talked about this with Scott DiCosenza on a number of occasions, but there are some novel charges that Trump has faced, essentially things that nobody else in the world has ever been charged with. Now, if he's convicted on one of those, rather than something that the general public can understand, like he lied on his tax returns or something,
right?
If he's convicted on a novel charge, I don't see how the 6% who said that they would change the vote, I don't see how they would bail on that, because it's kind of proving Donald Trump's point.
We've seen in 2023 how his persecution / prosecution has only benefited him. So we'd be foolish to rule out that could happen again. Now, the other, I think, big X factor for 2024, which some will overlook until the last minute, is who the presumptive nominee Donald Trump will select as his vice president. Now, many people will say, look, Donald Trump is dominant. It doesn't matter who his VP is because it's all about him. True, but he can only serve one term. And whoever he picks as vice president gets a huge jump for 2028. So we may see in who Donald Trump picks possibly the future of the Republican Party after 2028, when one way or another Trump will be gone from the public stage.
So do we who are we expecting then, Tim? Is it too early to make some predictions? I mean, I have a more recent what's the word? An idea floating around in my mind that he's actually going to pick Vivek Ramaswamy. The first time Donald Trump was running, he had 8 years ahead. He didn't want somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy. He wanted somebody like Mike Pence, because Donald Trump is the big gorilla in the room, and that's the way he wants it. This time, he's not going to be usurped by his vice president if he wins, because he's only got 4 years anyway. Tim, your thoughts on that just as we finish up?
But as we know, he also knows he has to win this election, and he picked Mike Pence in order to win the election. So if he follows the strategy of picking someone not that he likes, but that improves his chances, then he goes for Nikki Haley to appeal to women, to Vivek Ramaswamy to appeal to people of color, and so on. But I have to admit, for all the time I spent analyzing politics, far from making some outrageous prediction just to be spectacular, I can tell you honestly, I have no earthly idea who Donald Trump is going to pick as his running mate.
And that's probably the way Donald Trump wants it. The reality TV star comes out again. Tim Donner, thank you very much, and a very happy new year to you.
And you as well, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As 2023 draws to a close, we're here to examine the big cases of the year that shocked the establishment, that rocked DC, and generally entertained both Scott DiCosenza, host of the Excellent Uprising podcast and Liberty Nation's Legal Affairs editor, and myself in the most entertaining ways. Scott DiCosenza, thanks for being here.
Cheers, Mark. Always a pleasure.
So, Scott, I believe you prepared a few stories that you think are in your professional opinion as a constitutional attorney, believe are the top legal issue stories of the year to date.
My list is defensible in any company, Mark, and I think any keen observer of the court would at least agree with 4 out of 5.
Okay. So already Scott's batting an 80% rather than 100%, but we'll let that slide for now. So
Hall of Fame is 300 in baseball, Mark. So,
which is greater than 80? Presumably, in terms of whole numbers?
80 is 800. All right, I'm not going to confuse
80 is 800. That's how that works.
I'm not going to confuse you with American base. That's for Tim Donner to do. I will stick with
whose presence you can enjoy on the Excellent Uprising podcast. Please do check it out, where all good podcasts are provided, or on the pages of libertynation.com, which is an excellent place to be. So let's start with the big one, Scott. In your opinion, what is the biggest case for 2023?
Well, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. I think you'd be hard pressed to.
That's the affirmative action shutdown, right?
That is the
big one.
case that basically said affirmative action or racial discrimination for some people against others, even if those people have been put upon historically by laws, including African Americans, is not okay. And we've already seen, Mark, so there's been two reactions to that case, I think both of which were predictable. One is that the colleges and universities, the ones that are the most virulent discriminators, the ones who cannot abide judging a person just on the basis of their achievement, the Harvards and the Yales, for instance, they're doing everything they can to, I was going to say work around the ruling. Like, what's the right way to phrase it? You don't want to say not comply, because they would argue that they are trying to comply with the ruling.
Complying in the strictest possible, narrowest path which they can, and still increasing their minority numbers.
And for a cynic who may doubt their veracity, they may say that what they're doing is they're trying to game the system. But what I think happens generally in these cases is when a big change comes in, and we've seen this with guns cases, what happens is the reaction is to try to maintain all the bite of the law that was stricken down without some of the language that the court specifies as illegal. And yet what happens over time is the court whittles away those attempts to claw onto typically the law that was stricken
in subsequent
down. So
challenges, you mean?
Indeed. And I think that's what's going to happen for students for fair admission. And the other thing that's happened is, and this I think is the huge benefit to this decision across society, is many organizations that kind of take their guidelines from these what's allowed and what's legal and supported by the court have now decided to pare back and not engage in racial discrimination. So, for instance, scholarships that law firms offered, for instance, to only students of color, well, they're now opened up to all students, regardless of their race or origin.
At least on the surface.
Well, for law firms especially, it's kind of funny because
they do have lawyers on staff that could argue their case if it's a very narrowly tailored interpretation of the law.
I was going to go in a different direction than you did, Mark. I was going to say that if the lawyers see that there is a clear liability based on the newly established precedent, they're actually likely to be some of the first people to say, hey, you know what? Let's cover our butts over here and maybe not have to pay a giant
It's funny that we've gone the two separate directions on that, because it seems to me, and obviously I'm not involved in the jurisprudence, the legal world, thankfully, of any country. But it seems to me that
not all heroes wear capes.
Absolutely. So it seems to me that for some companies, and obviously a law firm is a company, that the social credit that they earn is worth more than running afoul of any laws that they could quite articulately defend against. And they could see it as this is more of a boost for us to be seen to be flaunting, at least outside of the courts, to be seen to be flaunting this kind of interpretation, because this shows that we're, behind the message, the progressive message. And that can bring them a lot of cash, a lot of notoriety, and a lot of new clients who are involved in the progressive sort of woke arena of lawfare.
I would say,
or am I just a cynic?
I think that I don't think that I think you're insufficiently cynical. Once again, Mark, what
you're the only person
who
who says this about me.
You're overvaluing the market benefit of participation in the various discriminatory practices. I think that's just de rigueur for that crowd. It's not, it's not the thing that differentiates them in the marketplace. It's just like all good people, if you would, that's what they do. But the fees, the legal fees, judgments and penalties they may or would have to pay out will really affect the bottom line. And beach houses and BMWs don't pay for themselves, Mark. So
absolutely,
I think that's
multi-$1,000 donations to Democrats also don't pay for themselves.
Indeed.
Or to Republicans for that matter, depending on which side.
They're happy to buy whoever's gonna, they don't care who paints their house, just as long as they get the color right,
Absolutely right. Now, so that's your big one for the year. I think I got to agree with you that that was also my thinking was that was the big case of the year, because it's really upending everything that has been in place since I was a kid. Certainly, the idea that affirmative action is the rule of the land and is a net positive to society and to the people. Whereas we've talked about this before on the show, that it's not necessarily a benefit to the people who are recipients of affirmative action, because they do oftentimes have. I remember somebody was saying this around Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that she would forever have an asterisk next to her name for being a hire, which I think is quite unfair based on her career and her accomplishments. But that is often the case with people who get their places through affirmative action. So I think it's a Christmas miracle that people will now be judged on their merits and their character.
By the way, she's not the only one. We're recording this the same week that former Associate Justice Sandra Day O'Connor lies in state in the courts in the courthouse, and she too. Reagan said that he would choose a woman to be a Supreme Court justice. So I think that, another asterisk that she wasn't chosen because she was the best choice for the court. But in truth, all of them have asterisks in one way or another, meaning
they're all
it's
political
a political decision. This is not
Yeah.
about some sort of merit where legal scholars can say, no, the acumen and the breadth and depth of knowledge and the tone and the measure of their gravitas and humanity. It's a political decision. So, but also, it seems like we can't have a society where it's cool to discriminate against some people on the basis of their race and not others. It either should be okay for universities, for instance, or employers to say racial discrimination is legal within our laws, or that it's not, but that it is legal for some and not others, and favored races and disfavored depending on the winds of politics. That seems to be the worst of all worlds.
Well, Scott, there was once a time in America where such a thing was perfectly legal and within the law. And I thought we'd moved on from that, but apparently not is the case.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott, we are going to be back with you, figuring out the best of the rest after this short break. Listeners, don't go anywhere. Thanks very much.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott DeCosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Earlier in the show, we are doing a roundup of the biggest cases of 2023 as the year draws to a close. And we determined, both of us, I think we had some nice congruency there, that the death of affirmative action was probably the most significant and possibly the most interesting. But I know there are some very, very interesting ones still remaining in your Santa's bag of tricks. No, it's presents, isn't it? It's not tricks. Maybe that was just at my household when I was growing up.
That's funny. The 303 Creative case was the follow-on from the sort of Gay Baker case or Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And in Masterpiece Cake Shop, a group decided that a baker who was a traditionally and conservatively Christian religious man, they wanted him to be forced to bake a cake celebrating a gay wedding. That case had a kind of tortured procedural history, which is why that led to the 303 Creative case, which was the case of a woman. This is from Colorado, where the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was also from. And Colorado had basically gone after these conservatives and said, not only do you have to do what we say, but you're going to like it or else. And they said, what about my religious rights and my free speech rights to basically practice my religion as I see fit and not have compelled speech. So this woman wanted to design websites only for weddings that she felt celebrated marriage in a way that was consistent with God's will under her interpretation of that. She didn't want to go ahead and celebrate same-sex weddings with the creation of websites for those customers. So she sued to say, is that okay? Or am I going to have to basically forfeit and be bankrupt because of my preferences? So this really dialed back all of the cry bullies who, wanted to stomp into conservative Christians, businesses, and bring them under heel.
Were the justices' thoughts on this then? What did they determine in the end?
Oh, Mark, this is the dividend of the Trump presidency for those of us who favor limited government, which is to say that the court now's majority often favors limited government, did so in this case. They said that even though those of us that are really on team limited government wanted I think a First Amendment win based on religion and speech, it came out as just for the compelled speech aspect of it. But in any case, it's a good decision for liberty, I think. Anytime that the people get to, decide for themselves how to speak and be, and there's less involvement for the government in those matters, I think is a big win.
It's something that gets so often overlooked is your ability to speak freely reflects directly your ability to think. And when people are compelling speech, they're not just telling you what to say in any given situation, that they're essentially torturing your mind into a position where you have to think right. And we have seen cases where people are being prosecuted for wrong think in the UK. And there's so much so there's a meme where, hello, sir, the policeman comes around to the house, I've come to check your thinking. And it's a troublesome thing, and it's great, I think, that the Supreme Court has given a free speech win. What else is on your list?
Troublesome doesn't begin to describe what you just said. I wish more Americans would think about it more often. It is, I got the goosebumps right now just thinking, Western societies where police come by to investigate the things that you said. And you are so right. To say that you can't say something is to say that you can't think it. That's why they do it. And that's why we have to resist it.
Very, very much so. It's possibly the most important fight that our generation, or of any localized generation to this point in time, is facing, is the ability to be able to think what you want to think, whether that's right or wrong, because that's what being human is. It's your ability to think separately. We're not ants. There's a slightly off topic. There's the Once and Future King books, where I believe it's the third book in that series about King Arthur and Merlin, where slightly off topic here, but he becomes various animals to learn how they think, so he can become a good king later on, at courtesy of Merlin's magic. And at one point he becomes an ant, and ants operate in a collective thing where they all think the same. And it's actually quite a damning indictment of an almost forced communism for a book that is well worth a read for anybody who's not read it. Okay. So, what else do we have in your Christmas sack, Santa D. Cosenza?
As it was the Sackett versus EPA decision, Mark, which really dialed back the level of regulation the EPA is able to offer. It was. What happens often is the Congress will pass a law that says we want to have clean air or clean water or clean something, and then authorizes the EPA to draft regulations consistent with that law. And then the EPA interprets those regulations to mean something else. So usually the law passed is fairly narrow, and then that's expanded by the regulations. And then the interpretation of the regulations expands beyond that. And so this ruling pared all that back to say that the interpretation and the rulings were far outside the authorizing law.
Scott, if you could explain this to me, because it seems to me that the Sackett versus EPA case, that must have some bearing on the upcoming Chevron deference case in the courts, doesn't it?
Well, Mark, the case that just happened with the Sackett versus EPA consisted of one particular regulation, the regulation of wetlands, right, and whether or not the EPA could regulate them based on the authorizing law. The upcoming case regarding the Chevron deference, which is Loper Bright Enterprises, concerns whether or not the way the federal government operates as a matter, or whether how the courts treat the federal government in their courtrooms. Okay. Which is to say they give deference to federal government understanding of regulations that the federal government themselves drafted, right? So EPA, for instance, in the Sackett case, it would be if the EPA drafted some other regulations and they go to court and they say, we think the regulation should mean X. In this case, courts may say, okay, well, you're the experts, you're the EPA. Well, there are plenty of those of us who say, no, the courts are independent and are charged with maintaining that independence through their own judgment and not deferring to agencies. And also, if you were going to have them defer to anybody, let's let them defer to the citizens. In other words, if a regulation, for instance, or law clearly doesn't negatively impact a person's rights or property, wouldn't we say that it's incumbent on the government to get their ducks in a row to pass something that does before taking away from the citizen?
So the deference case that will be, I guess that'll be decided in 2024. That will determine how the application of these various government agencies, all government agencies, in fact, is played out, and whether there will be more people's voices on it, I guess, because that's if the justices rule against the deference being standing law, that means that they have to find another way, and that way kind of has to involve either the people or the people's representatives to craft the certain laws. Is that right?
This is a judge-made rule. The Chevron deference refers to this case decades ago, and
Called Chevron.
it's just a rule where the Supreme Court says that they, and then therefore the courts that are under them, will give this deference. So all that's required for them to make a sea change in this area is to remove the deference, to say we are no longer going to extend this deference to the administration.
And then the whole of the federal government has to reorganize itself. That'll be a fun thing to come. Now, speaking of stories to come, cases to come, Scott, I always think in terms of stories, obviously, because I write. So the thing of stories to come, but these are actual cases to come. Well, what's coming down the pipeline in 2024? What's the case that you're looking forward to covering the most on the pages of LibertyNation.com?
Well, certainly Loper Bright Enterprises, which is the Chevron deference, is competing up there for number one. Another one is the Rahimi case, which I attended arguments for on behalf of LibertyNation.com. The first time I did sit in for the full argument in the press area. So for kind of sentimental reasons, I think that's interesting, but also for the legal implications. That's why I actually had been following the case and wanted to attend the arguments. That case concerns whether or not the Congress could kind of loop in a penalty that takes away people's gun rights if they are subject to a domestic violence restraining order. And a lot of the litigation around guns lately, around the margins, has to do with when you can take people's guns away regarding actions in the civil courts rather than in the criminal courts. And so that I think is a fascinating case that will tell us a lot about gun rights cases going forward with the current composition of this court.
Well, I think on top of the Bruen decision in 2022, I think a lot of people who respect gun rights and want the Second Amendment to be clearly articulated are keeping a very, very close eye on this case. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much for your Liberty Roundup, let's call it, our Talking Liberty Roundup. Much appreciated.
Happy New Year, Mark.
Happy New Year too. And that's about all we have time for on this week's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd just like to take a moment to say thank you to our special guests, Tim Donner and Scott DeCosenza, and of course, you, the listeners at home. Thank you for tuning in and wishing you a very, very prosperous and happy New Year's. Take care.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at LibertyNation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.